Welcome to Automotive Heaven with Richie Z. You know, after 26 years of doing television and radio, I think I finally got it right. But we're at a museum in the city of Chicago, but it's a private collection. It's a private museum that is not open to the public. So you'll actually never see any of these cars other than on our television show. For more information, go to www.richiez.com. That's R-I-C-H-I-E, Z like in zebra.com. We have television and radio shows there. We started a new venture a few years ago called Chicago History and Automotive Heaven. Well, today we are in Automotive Heaven, and we're going to show you some gorgeous automobiles from the past and the present in this private collection. Look at this gorgeous 2003 Bugnati. That's right, folks, Bugnati, not a Bugatti, Bugnati. It's a custom automobile, but look how gorgeous this automobile is. If you're a baby boomer like me, grew up in the 50s and 60s, this will look very familiar to you because I'm sure you went to a drive-in back in that era. You know what? I want to touch on some of the cars we have in this drive-in setting. In the corner here, we have a Fairlane 500, but it's a retractable. They called it the Skyliner back then. Interesting point on this automobile was it was a convertible hardtop. Here's the real interesting point back then. It's 1957. In 57, they made 300,000 of these Fairlane retractables. Very, very popular. People loved the car. Give you an idea of how popular it was, in 57, the iconic 1957 Chevrolet convertible only made around 40,000. So they made about 250,000 more of these Fairlanes. But the biggest problem they had with this roof was you could never on a hot day get it to open completely or close completely. It's kind of unique that they have it in the thing where they're showing you that the roof folds into the trunk, but there was a point designed inside the vehicle to make it go up and down. On a very, very hot day, and the weight of the top and lifting the trunk and everything made the points actually fuse together. So the top would get stuck and people would get wet if it started raining. They weren't able to put the top up. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Oldsmobile for 1958. This was a real interesting car. Oldsmobile was one of the first, in fact, I call it the first muscle car ever made because they came out with a Rocket 88 in 1948. So that was really the first muscle car ever made. But Oldsmobile has a rich history in the General Motors line also, where Rancid Olds was the first automobile made in the GM line, the oldest automobile made in the GM line. Plus, Rancid Olds was the one who actually started the assembly line. He had the first assembly line for an automobile, but Henry Ford was the one that perfected an automobile assembly line back in those days. Here we have a beautiful Packard automobile, and this is the one of my favorites, the Caribbean. This is a 1955. Packard was always a very elegant, stylish automobile in the automobile industry. In fact, kind of a neat thing about Packards, they're still making them, and they still have this style of body. When Packard went out of business, it was bought out by the Soviet Union. So Packards are still being made in Europe in the Soviet Union. And now we get into one of the most interesting, controversial automobiles of the 50s. That was the Edsel. It came on the scene. People really did love the styling, the look, but Edsel was really done up really well, where they had power windows, they had power seats, a lot of really new innovative ideas in the automobile industry. But one of the biggest problems with Edsel was Ford Motor Company did not spend a lot of money in marketing the Edsel automobile. So by that, and they had some problems with some of those new innovations, and that is one of the reasons Edsel never made it. But they're very sought after today, very popular, and I'll tell you something about the auto industry. Rare, unique, one of a kind is always sought after. Like these Edsels, because they are supply and demand. There's a large demand and a very small supply of them, which drives the price up higher. Gorgeous car in the 50s, the Edsel by the Ford Motor Company. 1916 Detroit Electric Brougham, this car was known as. Electric cars, folks. The World's Fair of 1893 in Chicago, the greatest World Fair ever held, was the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, Illinois. There was an electric car showed at that fair. Also, the first automobile race was in the late 1800s here in Chicago. It went from Michigan Avenue, where the Art Institute is, up to Evanston, Illinois, and back on Thanksgiving Day. About a 27-mile trip. There was an electric car in that also. But this is a 1916 Detroit electric car. Kind of an interesting looking automobile, to say the least. They didn't need a lot of hood space because there was no engine in there. But take a look at the round windows that we have in the automobile. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of the mansions that were built around the Chicago area, they actually used round glass in a lot of the mansions and churches in Chicago. The biggest problem they had with electric cars back then was they ran out of charge very quickly. They needed a lot of batteries, so the batteries added a lot of weight to the car. So it used a lot more power to move the car because of the weight of the batteries. The car that was in the race, the first automobile race in Chicago, actually ran out of charge about 5 miles, 6 miles, they claim, into the race. 1949 Oldsmobile 88, and I think I talked about it earlier in the show. Oldsmobile was the premier car of the muscle car era, and it started in 48 with the Rocket 88. But we have some custom automobiles I'm going to touch on right now, and some of the slogans from that era, from the late 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. So this was the Rocket 88. This Ford over here, I believe, is a 55. Kind of an interesting story with that, but this one, for a slogan, they called it the Little Darling. And very customized, but give you a little bit of cool history about Ford Motor Company. They weren't doing that well in the 50s. And they had a gentleman working for them. His name was Lee Iacocca. And he was a marketing marvel throughout his career. But he started at Ford Motor Company, and in 55 or 56, I think it was 56, he started with a slogan, in 56, buy a 56 for $56 down and $56 a month. And they sold, they quadrupled the sales of Ford back in the 50s because of Lee Iacocca. Now we have another interesting automobile, and it's called White Lightning. Now, that term became popular in the automobile industry because of bootleggers, rum runners they called them. In fact, to take you back in history, we did this story, we're going to be doing the story, more stories like this, on the radio show, Automotive Heaven. Junior Johnson was a rum runner, a bootlegger, and he was the one that actually started NASCAR and all of that. And then we have here Brookwood station wagon that someone converted into a convertible. Customizing automobiles has been around since the beginning of time. And we come on to a slogan that's been used in the industry I think still to this very day, when it comes to some of these automobiles, they call this the lead sled. And this is a gorgeous Mercury, 1950, really customized where they chopped the top down. I believe on this one, it looks to me like they cut about anywhere from 6 to 9 inches out of the roof line. This was not an easy task to do back then, folks. Even today, it's not an easy task to do because you got to cut all 4 doors down. You have to take so many inches out of the pillar. And then the most difficult thing was cutting the glass to make it fit in the new roof design. But they also dropped the car down and put a power source in there, an engine that really would light up the track. Now we have a 1964 Cadillac, and usually you don't see that many of these customized, but this is a real elegant looking. It's got the new modern wheels on it, the new drivetrain and all of that. And then we come on to the California Girl, which is just a gorgeous, gorgeous car. David Lee Roth actually owned this automobile and named it the California Girl. 1959 Rolls-Royce Phantom 5. Rolls-Royce has always been a car that when you become famous, when you really have finally made it, you actually go out and buy yourself one of these Rolls-Royces. It's the sign of finally making it, of luxury, of the automobile industry. In fact, David Ruffin from the Temptations actually bought a Rolls-Royce. His was white though when he made it, when they finally made a lot of money. But this one here has a little bit of Chicago history to it. This here, 59 Rolls-Royce Phantom, was actually owned by Art Kelly, the rhythm and blues artist, the singer. And he actually sold it to this collection in 2002. If you grew up as a kid in the 50s and 60s like I did, one of your favorite individuals, you heard him coming down the street, ringing his bells, was the Good Humor Man. They used to come by with little carts like this in the park, but also the Good Humor trucks. And the only thing they had were the bells to let you know they were coming. And you could buy your favorite ice cream from the Good Humor Man. 2004 Maybach 57 four-door sedan. Interesting story about these Maybachs. About 5 years ago, a sheik from the port of Dubai came to America and actually purchased a dozen of these Maybachs. Brand new. They were $320,000 each. Had them shipped over to the port of Dubai, which costs another $15,000. They all went on an airplane over to the port of Dubai. The reason he bought them was for his kids. And what his kids did with them was they played demolition derby in the desert with these automobiles. When they finished destroying them, they just left them there, and Mother Nature covered them up with sand. Now, just to let you folks know, every time you spend $3, $4, and even close to $5 a gallon for gas, this is the kind of things that they do with the money that they make off of selling us gasoline. 1963 Corvair. My first automobile, folks, I was 15 years old. I bought a Corvette Spider Monza in 1964. But let me give you a little history of the Corvair automobile. This was in my era. I'm a baby boomer, and I lived the era of the Corvair. One of the best economy cars General Motors ever made. But there was a character out of New York that didn't do well as a lawyer. So he went after somebody with big bucks, and that was General Motors. His name was Ralph Nader. He actually went after General Motors because he claimed this car was unsafe, which was a lie. Never proven to be unsafe. In fact, out of all the small cars made back in the 60s, this was one of the safest automobiles. But Ralph Nader actually wrote a book, Unsafe at Any Speed. And I'm going to tell you the real history of what actually happened. GM knew he was out gunning for them. They ignored him for a long time. But they actually wanted to find out who this guy was and why he was after the Corvair and after GM. So they hired a private investigator that was extremely sloppy. Ralph Nader found out that General Motors hired an investigator to actually go after him. Well, he went straight to the news media. When the news media found out that GM hired an investigator, it gave him traction as far as the Corvair and being unsafe. And that's the real story. That's the rest of the story about the Corvair. The federal government actually put in place a study, but those studies take a few years to do about the automobile. They bought a lot of them. They used them in crash tests and all of that. And they found out it was extremely safe compared to a lot of the other small cars during that same time period. But because of all the heat of Ralph Nader and everything, GM quit making them. And about 2 years after the last production Corvair was made, the study came out and it was found out that this was one of the safest rear-engine automobiles on the market back in the 60s. The Chevrolet Corvair, a wonderful economy car built in the 60s. 59 Cadillac Eldorado. Now this was a car back in the era. It was ending the 50s, and they wanted something that would take over the market shares of luxury. These cars not only were luxurious, but performance-wise, Cadillac was really in the top shelf with that. But Harley Earl was the one that started with these wings. Now this one here, this 59 Cadillac Eldorado has the largest wings, the tallest wings on an automobile, factory stamped out automobile in the history, and it became extremely popular. They actually built over 11,000 of these automobiles. In the 80s, the middle 80s, late 80s, these took on a whole new life, and they were really sought after. When they were bringing only about $10,000 or $12,000 for a nice one back then, they actually soared at the auctions to about $300,000 was paid for one of these cars. But this was with the two, they called it the bullets on the back, the two bullet taillights, and the really extremely high wings. Now we go into 1960, Cadillac went into the Eldorado Biarritz. Now Biarritz, really all it did was add a lot of chrome. They shortened the wings, put the taillights in the wings. They didn't want to copy what they did the year before. The body style is basically the same. The wings are just a little bit different. But this is another gorgeous car. Being a Biarritz, they put more moldings and more chrome on the car. This one is kind of cool because it has a fiberglass cover for the convertible top. This is actually known in the industry as a parade boot. So cars are like this are actually used in parades all over the world. So people can actually sit on this fiberglass boot. It's a three-piece boot that fits over the convertible top. 1959 and 1960 Cadillac Eldorado. 1976 Cadillac Eldorado convertible. You know, back in the 70s, I was around, and the federal government got interested in the automobile industry, and they deemed these cars to be unsafe. Convertibles were unsafe. From the beginning of time with the automobile industries, there was convertibles. The federal government stuck their nose in and said no. So this was the last year of the Cadillac Eldorado convertible, 1976. Here's another car that came about in about the 1970s, early 80s. This is a 1983 Excalibur Series 4 Phantom. Now this one's interesting because it's a four-seater. A lot of these came through, they were only two-seaters. Now a lot of guys, I remember back then, these were like $15,000 or as high as $20,000. When an average car back then, a luxury car, was under 10. What's cool about this one is it actually has a 305 engine in it. In the very beginning in the 70s, they were putting the large engines, the high performance engines, and there was a lot of issues about overheating. But this is a gorgeous replica. This Excalibur Car Company's had its trials and tribulations. I just talked to somebody in Wisconsin. They bought the company and they're building these again. So these are very elegant. It gives you that old flavor, that old school look, as they say in the automobile industry. 1983 Excalibur. Growing up in the 50s and 60s, I remember an entertainer that used the line, "How sweet it is." That was Jackie Gleason. He started out with the Honeymooners, but he was an entertainer before that. But he went on to have a variety show and everything out of Miami Beach. Well, this is a 1974 Excalibur that was actually owned by Jackie Gleason. 1979 Auburn Boat Tail Speedster. Got some interesting things about this automobile. This is actually a replica, but it's one of the finest replicas I have seen built of a car like this. Now, sometimes people will ask about, is this the original color? Could they have come in a color combination like we see in here on camera? Well, folks, Cord took over the Auburn company in the 20s. And when he came in, they were not selling well. We're going to actually do that story on Automotive Heaven, our radio show at RichieZ.com. But what he did, they had a whole lot full of, I've heard anywhere from 700 to 900 automobiles on the lot that were already built. When he came into the company, and he took over as CEO, he actually had them bring them back in, sand them down, and repaint them. And he put colors like this on. And you were able to pick colors that you wanted for the automobile. This is a replica of the automobiles in very, very gorgeous shape. We have one right behind it, and that one is a 1980 Auburn Boat Tail Speedster. These were supercharged engines. Auburn's actually came out with front-wheel drive automobiles. But the Boat Tail Speedster has an interesting story in it. The reason they came up with that idea was when you were drag racing automobiles back then, and even today, if you get close enough to the car in front of you, you're in his tailwind, and you actually are being drawn with him. So you're not using as much energy. So the Boat Tail Speedster was designed to eliminate that issue in the racing industry. This has a wonderful history in the automotive industry. Edward V. Rickenbacker actually was a bomber pilot in World War I back in 1918. He actually started the Rickenbacker Car Company in Detroit. This is a beautiful 1926 Rickenbacker 8-cylinder Sport, but this was his actual personal car. As you can see, everything is done in brass and copper instead of chrome. He was a stickler about that, even the door hinges, the wheels, the lights, the bumpers, and all of that. This car has a rich history because it was owned by Rickenbacker. He was actually one of the key players that started Eastern Airlines also. Rich history. This is a car that's worth in excess of $1 million. If it went through the auction today, I think it'll bring a lot more than $1 million just because of its rich history. So if you're looking for that antique automobile, look for something that's rare, that's unique, one of a kind, or owned by a celebrity or someone like Edward V. Rickenbacker. If you'd like to advertise on the Chicago History and Automotive Heaven television and radio show, you can contact me at 312-841-2560. Email me at rautomd@gmail.com. Go to our website and check out all of our stuff. We have a sponsors page on there at richiez.com. That's www.richieze.com. If you have a business, product, or a service, we can put together a package that'll help benefit your business, product, or service. Or if you just like to donate, it's a pledge drive. You can donate to our show and keep us on the air. We're actually looking for sponsors to do a lot more shows like you've seen today. I'm Richie Z. Thank you for watching.